Ladies and gentlemen, it's my role to act as the umpire between these two doughty champions, each for a deeply held conviction. They will have the opportunity to speak 3 times. The first occasion will be 15 minutes, and then the second and third speaking opportunities will be limited to 7 minutes. Thereafter, there will be a time of questions, as Gilbert has explained, and as those questions are gathered in, it's my task to read them, to decipher them, and then to pose the questions on your behalf. So I would be very, very grateful if you could either use capital letters or at least very good handwriting. I say that as someone whose handwriting is indecipherable, but for you, I would invite you to make it as legible as possible, to make my task as easy as possible. So without further ado, I'm going to call upon Dr. David Blass to make his opening statement, which is 15 minutes long. Dr. Blass.
Thank you very much, Stephen and Gilbert, for the introduction. It's a great privilege to be taking part in the discussion this evening, and I'm very grateful to Michael for travelling up to participate in it. The last time Michael and I had a discussion on this topic, it lasted for less than 10 minutes on the radio, but it continued for about 3 hours over coffee afterwards, so I'm hoping we won't keep you quite as long as that this evening. I think we both gained some understanding of where the other person was coming from, and I hope we can make further progress on that this evening. The topic tonight is, does God exist? My approach to this question will be to consider theism, the belief that God exists, and atheism, the belief that there's no God and indeed no supernatural reality, as 2 rival hypotheses, or 2 ways of trying to make sense of the universe in which we live. I will attempt to show that there are a range of features of the universe and our existence in it which provide evidence for theism and against atheism. But what do I mean by evidence? Some people might think of evidence in terms of what you can see, or in terms of an experiment that could be carried out in a lab. But that's much too narrow, even in science, never mind in other contexts. But fortunately, there's a way to think about evidence that's generally accepted. And it's quite straightforward. Basically, it can be put like this. Something provides evidence for a hypothesis if it's the kind of thing we would expect if the hypothesis is true, and not the kind of thing we'd expect if the hypothesis is false. That might sound a bit abstract, so here's a simple example. You know that Liverpool were playing Man United in the cup final, but you missed the match. You arrive home afterwards, after you know the outcome will have been decided, and you switch on the TV. And you discover that the Liverpool fans are celebrating while the Man United fans are disconsolate. Now, admittedly, that might be just wishful thinking on my part, but let's just suppose. Clearly, the evidence supports the hypothesis that Liverpool won. Why? Because it's just what you'd expect if Liverpool had won, and not at all what you'd expect if they hadn't. I will argue that a number of features of the universe are not at all surprising if there is a God. That is, a supremely powerful, intelligent, and benevolent creator. But very surprising if atheism is true. I won't have time to raise objections, but I'm sure Michael will do that, and I'll come back to those later. I want to start by looking at 2 sets of laws. First, the laws of nature, and then the laws of morality. The idea is that these point to a lawgiver. If science tells us anything, it tells us that there's a great deal of order in the universe, from the large-scale structure of the universe right down to the microscopic world of subatomic particles, and at every level in between, we find order everywhere. Much of this order is expressed in terms of the laws of science. Now, the question I want to ask is, why is the universe like this? Why can the universe be described by scientific laws? And why is there so much order in the universe? From an atheistic perspective, there doesn't seem to be any good reason to expect so much order. But if God exists, the order in the universe wouldn't be at all surprising. It certainly wasn't surprising to the founders of modern science. They expected to find order in the universe and laws to describe it precisely because they believed it was the work of a rational creator. In fact, for many of them, that was their motivation for doing science. There also seems to be a purpose in the laws of nature, and indeed in the universe more generally. Over the last 40 years or so, scientists have discovered what's known as the fine-tuning of the universe. A whole range of physical quantities are just right for life to exist. If any one of them were slightly different, life would be impossible. Here's just one example. Consider 2 of the fundamental forces of nature, the electromagnetic force and the gravitational force. If the ratio between them differed by about 1 part in 10 to the power of 40, that's a 1 with 40 noughts after it, then life would be impossible. And that's just one example. Many could be provided, but the overall evidence is clear. The famous cosmologist Stephen Hawking sums it up. The laws of nature form a system that is extremely fine-tuned. Were it not for a series of startling coincidences and the precise details of physical law, it seems humans and similar life forms would never have come into being. End quote. What's the best explanation for this evidence? Given the degree of precision involved, chance is hopeless as an explanation. Some have claimed that our universe is only one of many, possibly infinitely many universes, but there's no evidence for their existence. And even if they did exist, they mightn't escape the need for design anyway. So from an atheistic perspective, there's no good reason to expect fine-tuning. By contrast, it wouldn't be at all surprising if God exists, since it's a very precise example of the sort of order we would expect in a universe created by God. Let's now turn to the laws of morality. Whether we believe in God or not, we all know that certain types of behaviour are morally wrong, murder and rape being two obvious examples. Now, there are very good reasons for believing that there are objective moral truths in the sense that they apply to everyone, that they are not due to human consensus, and that they're part of the way things are. Just as there are physical facts, there are also moral facts. Now, many atheists agree with what I've said about morality so far, and I want to stress that. I also want to stress that the issue here is not about moral behaviour. People can act morally without a belief in God. The challenge, however, is to make sense of objective morality from an atheistic perspective. Atheists can appeal to ethical systems which tell us that certain actions are intrinsically wrong, or that we should act in such a way as to enhance human well-being. But there are two major problems. The first concerns the existence of moral values, such as goodness and justice, because it's far from clear where these fit into an atheistic universe. As Richard Dawkins has put it, in a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, or any justice. End quote. The second problem relates to moral obligations. The laws of morality are real and binding. For example, it's not merely a good idea not to murder, but we have an obligation not to do so. But from an atheistic perspective, where do such obligations come from? Why do we have them? It's very difficult to see why morality should always override considerations of self-interest, nationalism, or ideology if atheism is true. If God exists, however, the picture is very different. We live in a moral universe, with God as the moral lawgiver, and so there's a foundation for moral values and obligations. So objective morality makes perfect sense in a universe created by God, but does not fit at all easily into an atheistic universe. For this reason, morality provides further evidence for the existence of God. Another piece of evidence is the beginning of the universe. Until the early 20th century, there was no reason on the basis of astronomical evidence to doubt that the universe was infinitely old. This situation changed dramatically as a result of one of the most important findings of 20th century science, the discovery that the universe is expanding. Since the universe is expanding, this means that if you go back in time, it's contracting. And according to the standard Big Bang theory, it eventually goes back to a state known as a singularity, which is a boundary of both space and time. In other words, according to this theory, the universe had a beginning. Cosmologist John Barrow and Frank Tipler put it like this: at this singularity, space and time came into existence. Literally nothing existed before the singularity, so if the universe originated in such a singularity, we would truly have a creation ex nihilo. That is, a creation out of nothing. However, as Stephen Hawking has pointed out, many people do not like the idea that time has a beginning, probably because it smacks of divine intervention. End quote. In subsequent decades, various models were proposed to try to avoid a beginning, but further evidence and theoretical results made the case for a beginning stronger. New rival theories continue to be proposed, but most of these are highly speculative and have no clear evidence in their favour. Also, research by three leading cosmologists, Bohr, Booth and Valentin, places considerable constraints and attempts to avoid a beginning. Now, of course, we can speculate about how science might develop in the future, but based on the best evidence available, there's plenty of reason to affirm, and little if any to deny, that the universe had a beginning. Now, if the universe had a beginning, this raises an enormous problem for atheism. It's highly implausible, if not downright irrational, to believe that a universe could come into existence uncaused out of absolutely nothing. For this reason, a beginning to the universe is extremely surprising if atheism is true. By contrast, it's not at all surprising if God exists, and is of course what Christianity has traditionally affirmed. Once again, this means it provides strong evidence for the existence of God. The final reason that I want to offer for the existence of God relates to Jesus of Nazareth. Despite never holding a position of political or religious power, he's had greater influence in human history than anyone else who has ever lived. His life and teaching are held in high regard by people from a wide variety of perspectives, including people with different religious beliefs and also atheists. There's even an organisation called Atheists for Jesus. And I wondered if it's maybe possible for us to establish some common ground here. Perhaps Michael and I could set up an organisation called Atheist Ireland for Jesus. Some people think that unless you already accept the Gospels as a revelation from God, there's no evidence to go on. But that's quite simply false. Historians are agreed that many facts about Jesus' life are well established. But here I want to focus on some well-supported historical facts relating to the aftermath of his death. These include the following: that Jesus' body was buried in a tomb, that the tomb was empty, found to be empty a few days later, that multiple appearances took place in which many people who had known Jesus well believed they'd seen him alive again, that Paul, who initially persecuted the early Christians, became a follower himself as a result of believing he had seen the risen Jesus, that the Christian movement started in Jerusalem, the very place Jesus had been crucified, shortly afterwards, and the transformation of the early followers of Jesus, many of them being willing to die for their faith. And there are many more facts, but I won't take time to list them. I don't have time to look at each of these, but let me quote the classical scholar Michael Grant on the empty tomb. He himself doesn't believe in the resurrection, but he argues that the historian, and I quote, cannot justifiably deny the empty tomb. True, this discovery, as so often is described differently by the various Gospels, as critical pagans early pointed out. But if we apply the same sort of criteria that we would apply to other ancient literary sources, then the evidence is firm and plausible enough to necessitate the conclusion that the tomb was empty. It's important to point out that these facts aren't supernatural in and of themselves. A tomb can be empty, for example. The question is, what's the best explanation for the evidence? And I would suggest that far and away the best explanation is that God raised Jesus from the dead. Common alternatives, such as that the disciples stole the body or that Jesus didn't really die, have been decisively rejected because they don't account for all the evidence. But surely you might say we know that dead people don't rise. Well, we know that they don't normally rise. But if there's a God, what's to prevent him from bringing about a resurrection? And if we aren't simply going to rule out the existence of God from the start, then the only course of action is to consider the evidence. The context is also important. That is, the context of Jesus' life, his teaching, and the unique claims he made. It's a striking coincidence that it's Jesus of Nazareth, not any other prophet or religious leader, for whom there's significant evidence that he rose from the dead. So I would suggest that the resurrection hypothesis accounts for all the facts remarkably well, and there are no plausible naturalistic explanations. For example, to take one naturalistic explanation, even if Jesus had somehow managed to survive death by crucifixion at the hands of Roman soldiers, which is extremely unlikely in the first place, how could a half-dead man in need of serious medical attention convince his followers that he was a resurrected Messiah who had defeated death? Let me conclude by summarising the case. I've presented 4 pieces of evidence, or rather 4 categories of evidence, that count in favour of theism and against atheism. the evidence of the laws of nature, including the fine-tuning of various quantities, the evidence of the laws of morality, the evidence for the beginning of the universe, and the evidence relating to the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. In answer to the question, does God exist? This evidence gives us good reason to believe that the answer is yes.